been away for 6 months to me, but may not feel like that long for you guys. You may hate that I'm back. You may have enjoyed Hank so much while I was gone that you wish I'd stayed gone longer. But certainly do want to appreciate or say thanks to Hank for filling in for me while I was gone, for the elders for allowing me to be gone, and for you guys also to put up with my being gone. And so I am thankful for being back. Looking forward to our study today. Long time ago, whenever we last studied together, we were looking at the book of Acts. And I mentioned in that study, we're kind of going through a series that involves going through the Bible and studying a specific outline. But I mentioned in that study that we got up through Acts chapter 8, that we're actually going to rewind and go back to the book of Genesis. Now, we're not going to, totally abandon the book of Acts, but if you're familiar with the narrative in the book of Acts, basically the first part of it deals with the Apostle Peter, and then the second part of it deals with the Apostle Paul. And so from chapter 9 to the end of the book, you kind of had the conversion of Paul and his missionary journeys, and so we'll come back and study that, Lord willing, a little later on. But if you do have your Bibles, I'd invite you to turn over with me to, I'll get this right here in a minute. I had to divide this slide too many times. But to Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11. We're going to be studying the Tower of Babel. I've heard it called the Tower of Babel. I don't have any qualms with either one of those. But we're going to be talking about it as we read in the first part of Genesis chapter 11. And we're going to dive right in because we've got a lot of historical ideas and things to bring out, I think, from the text that might help further your understanding a little bit about this particular event. You know, this story is one that, especially when I was younger in my mind, I had a hard time, understanding everything that was exactly going on. And of course, as the years progress and you study God's Word more and more, I think it's just natural that you come to a better and a fuller understanding of the meanings of what is exactly happening in these passages. And so this morning we're going to bring out a lot of historical facts. You might find it interesting, you might find it boring, but I always find it interesting when you put the Bible in context of the things that were happening in the events of that day and age. And so notice with me in verse 1 here of Genesis chapter 11. And right off, there are two major facts about the early human race that are revealed to us in this chapter. In verse 1, it says, "Now the whole earth had one language and one speech." The whole earth at this point, of course, refers to Noah and the descendants of his small family. Remember, we can all go back and trace our beginning with Adam and Eve, but we know that God cleansed the earth in Genesis chapter 6 through about chapter 10 there, and that Noah and his family were given a fresh start. And so it's only natural that there would only be one language upon the earth. But here's a distinction I think that we miss, or a lot of people miss, sometimes as you read verse 1 here. Note there's a distinction made between one language and one speech. While it is true that the whole earth spoke the same language at this particular time, it is also true that they were of one speech. And in the Hebrew, whenever you read about something being in one speech, what you're reading about is the idea that they were speaking the same things. It's unity of mind, unity of ideology. You go over to the New Testament in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 10, where Paul would write to the church at Corinth. He said, "Now I plead with you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing." That's the idea of one speech. They are united in ideology. They are united in their goals that they have for this particular society. And so the point is, it was their speech, not just the fact that they spoke the same language, but it was also their ideology that enabled them to do a lot of things, to communicate, to share things together, to help one another, to work together, to play together, to learn together. Their common ideology did for them what it does for us as Americans in a lot of ways. You know, you look at America today and you ask this question: what is it that enables us to live and to work together as a society and to advance as a civilization? It's our ideology, isn't it? And when you start getting conflicting ideologies, you're not going to advance as one in a society. So what we learn early on is not only did they speak the same language, but they also shared the same ideology. So let's take a look. Let's begin by looking at the scheme that this united people, this united earth, comes up with. In verse 2, here's what we read. It came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. So what we learn is basically kind of on a map, a general area where we can place this early civilization. We read them about settling in the land of Shinar. What we know as we study the Bible is this was probably the area of what we would deem, or what would have been deemed in that day and age, as southern Mesopotamia. Now, if you're not if you're not into Bible geology, that's okay. You just kind of write this down somewhere, and maybe one day you'll get interested in kind of figuring some of these things out and go back and take a look at it. It is important to our story, though. And so that's why I bring it up this morning. If you're trying to associate a nation with this particular area, you would probably read a lot in the Old Testament about the nation of Babylon. Okay, that's kind of the area, the geographical area that we're talking about here. Why is that important? Because Mesopotamian building materials were different than that of what we would think in Palestine building materials. Okay, when you go over into the promised land, the land of Canaan and Israel, and you start reading about their structures, what you have to understand about Palestine is Palestine had a lot of stone. And so a house or a building was usually laid on a big foundation of stone. Very important and expensive houses were made out of all stone. But stone was an easy and readily available material. However, when you go over into Mesopotamia, you don't have that same kind of building material. There are not a lot of stones in that plain area. And so this is why the writer tells us this in verse 3. Notice what they say. They said to one another, "Come, let us make us bricks and bake them thoroughly." And so they had brick for stone and had asphalt for mortar. Why is that important? Because most superstructures that were built in the area of Mesopotamia were not built out of stone like in Palestine. If you were going to build something out of stone, then you're going to, first of all, it would cost a lot of money, because you're going to have a lot of labor, and you're going to have to haul that stone in from a very long ways away. So what did they do for important superstructures? They baked bricks. They kiln-dried bricks. And those bricks became very hard, and some say they were harder than even stone itself, becoming a very good material for building something that was important. That's why the author is telling us this. Now, also, if you study the buildings in that particular area, not only did they use kiln-dried brick for very important structures, they also had a certain mix that they would use to seal that brick so that they could make that structure waterproof. So what we're reading about here is a very important structure that's being built in the eyes of the people. Not only is it built out of kiln-dried bricks, but it is also being sealed and made waterproof so that it would last longer. You study the buildings, again, of Palestine, you're going to read about stone structures for the foundation. If you're rich, you had entirely stone. But stone structures for the foundation, basically mud bricks. Not kiln-dried bricks, but mud bricks that were used, or mud mix that was used for the structure, the superstructure of those houses. So what we have here in verse 3 is a contrast. The contrast between how you would build something in Palestine versus how you would build something in Shumar or Shinar. And what we're learning about by reading this is this was, to the people, this was a very important structure that they were building. because they used these kiln-dried bricks. They waterproofed it so that it would last longer. So you might ask again, well, what are we to gain from all that? It helps lead us, I think, to a proper consideration of what exactly these people are building. Okay, a lot of people will read it and say, what's the big deal? It's just a tower, right? Not really. It's a little bit more than just a tower. Notice with me in verse 3 here. Here's what they say to one another. They say, come, let us make bricks, bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone. They had asphalt for mortar. In verse 4, here's what they're going to build. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. I don't know about you, but most of the time, especially when I was younger, and I remember hearing about the story of Babel, the emphasis was on the tower, right? Well, it was more than just a tower they were building. See, the people were building an entire city structure, and in the middle of that city structure, or the heart of that city structure, they were building a tower whose heights would reach up into heaven. Now, again, that's important because of archaeology and because of buildings and things of this nature in this particular area. But a couple of ideas that are worthy, I think, of our consideration. Number one, at this particular time, a city was not built for the same reason we build cities today. Okay, when we build cities today, it's for people to live in, right? That was not a way a city was built back then. A city, the heart of the city, was built out of important materials that would last a long time. And basically, in that city, what you had is you had granaries, you had storage houses, you had everything that you needed to survive as a society. And all the people didn't live in the city, they lived around the city, so that they could protect their resources and they could freely have access to their resources. What you'll also find as you read about these important structures that are built in the city historically, again, go back to this time period and study a little bit. Not only did you have granaries, storehouses, you also had like court systems. People didn't live in these buildings, but they used these buildings for the good of society. And generally, what you had in these civil or what we would call primitive civilizations, you had a temple of some sort to worship whatever was the main god of that particular city. Now, you might go from city to city, and you might have a different temple within the heart of all those cities. It was just dependent upon the god that was the main deity, or what the people considered the main deity of that city. And so you read about them, first of all, their idea was, come and let us build a city. And what were they going to build inside of this city? A tower. So that Hebrew word, it's not a specific word, it's just kind of a general word for a structure that is built very high. A lot of times in the Old Testament, it'll be translated as a watchtower. Remember, children of Israel built walls. On those walls, they would build an elevated tower where somebody could ascend to the top and look out and see a long ways and warn the city of incoming danger. Well, the problem is this: when we read about that in the Old Testament and we're reading about Israelite cities, that's the way an Israelite city was built. This is not an Israelite city. This is a Mesopotamian city. And what we learn in this particular time period as we go back, and again, archaeologists have dug a lot of these things up, when you read about these, or you study about these early civilizations, they had within their city a tower. And that tower was called, we call it in American a ziggurat. If you're British, or your English is a little British, you could call it a ziggurat. But that's the same idea. A ziggurat. Well, what does that particular thing mean? It means a very tall tower whose heights reach to the heavens. And what we learn about this particular
time is you're reading about them building this giant tower whose top is going to reach into heaven. Why would they build a tower like that? Well, again, if you go back archaeologically and you start digging and you find this time period, what you're going to find is these types of towers that were devoted for religious purposes to these cities. So I believe what we're reading about here is a ziggurat. I mean, socially, that would fit into the context. Historically, that would fit into this particular context. And when you read about these things, here's the interesting thing. In Mesopotamian literature, when you read about these structures, almost all of Mesopotamian literature talks about how these towers' head would reach into the heavens. And so I think that's exactly what we're reading about, or the concept that we have here in Genesis chapter 11. Now, if you're wondering what exactly does a ziggurat look like, this was the best picture that I could find. Don't ignore kind of the bottom section and look toward the top and the superstructure up there and all the people that you see standing on top of it. And this is a general idea of what a ziggurat would look like within the heart of a city. In fact, a lot of these ziggurats that have been, dug up, they resemble a pyramid in at least appearance. But their function wasn't the same as a pyramid. The Egyptians used pyramids to store things and used them for, practical or social purposes. These were built very differently. The outside of these structures were kiln-dried bricks that were waterproofed. However, the inside was just filled with mud. It was basically a structure that was filled up or built on the outside, and then basically you had filler in the inside. The building wasn't used for any practical or storage purposes or things like that. So you might think, well, why in the world would they build something like this then? It's interesting as you read about this, again, a lot of historical things, but archaeologists have discovered nearly 30 ziggurats in this general region. They've uncovered, they've found at least ruins. Ancient Mesopotamian texts talk about a lot more that were built in this particular region. But there was one common feature in all of these structures that they found. And that was there was some type of stairway or some type of ramp that led to the very top of this structure. Now, not all of them were designed the same. This particular one has kind of one main ramp that leads up to the top. Some of them were built in levels, where basically one level was recessed from the next, and you could walk around the edge of that structure and have a stairway that leads up to the top. But they all had this particular same quality or characteristic in common. That at the top was a very flat area, and that area ranged in size. In fact, as I was reading about some of these, the smallest ziggurat that was uncovered on the top of it was 3,600 square feet. So that gives you kind of an idea of what was happening, or at least the space here at the top of them. The largest that was uncovered was actually 40,000 square feet at the top. What was there at the top? Why did you need a stairway leading to the top? Well, at the top, there was usually something like a bed and a table or something of that nature. At the bottom, now here's the thing to emphasize. There was no worship that took place on top of these ziggurats. That wasn't the purpose of it. The worship place was at the bottom. Generally at the bottom of this stairway, there was some kind of temple that was built where people would go and worship this deity or this god that they believed protected their city. As you look through these ziggurats, you'll come across some names that are inscribed given to these particular superstructures that were built at this time. I think that's one of the best indicators of the function of these particular superstructures. One was found in Babylon. I'm not going to try to attempt to pronounce the name of it, but here's what the name meant that was inscribed upon it. Temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. There was one that was found at Larsa, uncovered at Larsa, and inscribed with a name which means temple which links heaven and earth. The most significant find, as far as it comes to names, was found in Cypar, and the name that was given to it means this: the temple of the stairway to pure heaven. In each one of these, you have the idea of this is a structure that links heaven to earth. And it's interesting, as you go back again through Mesopotamian mythology, their idea of how the gods traveled between worlds, between heaven and earth, was through a staircase. And so in their minds, this was a way to assist the gods, to get them basically to come down to them and to bless them. You go again throughout that historic, I know that's a lot of history and a lot of things behind it, but I think it gives so much significance to the story that we're reading about here in Genesis chapter 11. Their idea was if they put a bed and they put a table up there, they would provide a place for the gods to stop and to rest, give them anything that they needed. The gods would appreciate that. They would walk down the stairs. They would go straight into their temple. They would receive their worship from them. And because they did this for their God would then bless them. And so it was the human mythology of how God works and how God operates here upon this earth. What does all that mean? Well, if you sum it all up, here's what I deduce from reading in Genesis chapter 11. The Tower of Babel was basically a project that featured a ziggurat, which was designed for the gods to use. It was designed for the gods to travel from heaven down to earth, to go into that temple, to receive their worship, to receive their sacrifices. And because they did this for these gods, then they expected these gods to bless them. That was the scheme of the Tower of Babel. Let's talk about the sin. Now, you breathe a sigh of relief here. This is the last point I'm going to get to today. So we're going to save the third one after our all-in-one. But let's get right down to what was the sin of what these people were doing. Basically, there's two common interpretations that are usually given to this project. And one of them is, pride. The other one involves the idea of disobedience when it comes to filling the earth. And I'm just going to tell you this. I always tell you guys, I don't take this as Bible fact. This is just my opinion. Those two explanations to me are not without drawbacks. Okay, there's just some things you can't explain when you take one of those two views. And so what I want for you to think about just briefly with me here this morning, let's talk about if it is disobedience, what disobedience was it, and how can we be sure of it? Probably you've heard it preached, or I know I did growing up, that the disobedience was a violation of a divine command that God gave humanity to fill the earth, right? You can go back to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28, where God told Adam and Eve, he said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. I often think about this. Don't want to get too deep in thought this morning, but how many people do you think would have left the Garden of Eden? I don't know. What was God talking about when he said fill the earth? Was he talking about occupy every piece of land in the earth, or was he talking about multiplying and reproducing? You go over to Noah and his story in Noah chapter 9 and verse 1. God reiterates that command when those 8 souls step off the ark, and he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. How were they supposed to fill the earth? Well, wasn't it by being fruitful and multiplying? That's how humanity was going to fill up the earth. And so you have this command that God gives them, and I think a lot of people say, well, that command meant they had to spread out. right? That's what God was telling them to do when he told them to fill the earth. And part of the proof that people often offer for that is in verse 4, the people were afraid of being scattered, right? They didn't want to be spread out. Well, a couple of things to kind of point out again. If you go down to verse 7 of Genesis 9, I think you'll find a divine commentary on what it means to fill the earth. God says, as for you, be fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth. How were they supposed to fill the earth? Was Noah supposed to go over here? Was his son supposed to go over here? Was the other son supposed to go over here? That's not how they lived, was it? If God's command was to fill the earth, to scatter, then Noah and his family violated it from the very beginning. But yet they stayed intact as we read about them, didn't they? They stayed as that family unit. But they were filling the earth because they were reproducing as God had commanded them. So the point that I would make is this: if the disobedience was the fact that they weren't moving to different parts of the land, that started with Noah. Because Noah and his family didn't go anywhere in the beginning when God said, fill the earth, right? The command wasn't to scatter on the face of the earth. The command was to be fruitful and multiply, to reproduce and fill the earth. And if you read the text there in Genesis chapter 11, they were doing a good job of that. They're doing quite well. But they did say in verse 4 of Genesis chapter 11, we don't want to be scattered. Were they afraid of being scattered, somebody might ask? Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know why anybody wouldn't be afraid of that. You know, you think about the idea of family today. How many of us like when our families are scattered? I mean, wouldn't we all much prefer it if we stick together in the same area? Yeah. It's not a bad thing when people stick together. In fact, it's a good thing. I think the Bible teaches us that we are better together than we are apart. Don't you think that's a biblical principle? Sure. But in the story, I want you to notice this: they're not living in one place. They're moving all over. They're scattering. In fact, they've gone into the land of Shinar, and you might stop and ask yourself, well, why would they be scattering? And the answer is resources. You can't stay in one area too long, or you're going to run out of resources. Remember the story of Genesis 13 of Abraham and Lot? Abraham and Lot were both very rich in cattle, in herds and flocks. And so what happened? They stayed together, didn't they? But it created a problem. The problem was there wasn't enough grass and water for both of the flocks of Abraham and Lot, and so fights started happening. And so they had to scatter, didn't they? They had to move away from one another in order that they didn't run out of resources. Listen, this group had been together for a long time. And again, if the idea of the disobedience was not scattering, that started with Noah. Because God told him right there on the spot, he said, fill the earth. And if his family didn't divide and scatter, they would have violated God's command right from the beginning. The command was to reproduce. The command was to fill the earth. Somebody might say, well, what about pride, right? Because in verse 4, when you read about them, their sin was pride. They said, let us make a name for ourselves. The desire to make a name for yourself, to leave your mark on the world, to be remembered after death. Let me refer you back to the promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. Do you realize that part of the attractiveness of God's offer to Abraham was his promise to make a name for him? Making a name for yourself isn't always bad. Now, there's motive behind it. That can determine whether it's good or whether it's evil. But it's always driven by some kind of pride. The question becomes, what kind of name do we want to make for ourselves? What kind of name do we want? What do we want us to be remembered for here upon this earth? But all of us have that desire, don't we? Some people look at their language and say, well, as you read in verses 3 through 4 there, it looks like they're pretty self-absorbed, right? In verse 3, they say, let us. And then again in verse 4, they say, let us. And then in the latter part, they said, let us make bricks. Let us bake them. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower. Let us make a name for ourselves.
let me ask you this. What else were they supposed to say? Let them do it? I mean, let God do it? I think they were just using the common speech of that day and age. And you might look at all this and you might say, well, if their sin wasn't disobedience and their for not filling the earth or scattering, and their sin wasn't pride, what was it? And this is what I come back to, the ziggurat issue. You see, our study has shown that a function of a ziggurat assumes an incorrect concept of God. A function that is not rooted in divine revelation, but rather in human mythology. And so the ziggurat was their way in their name. That was their name-making venture. That's how they wanted to make a mark on the world and society. That's how they wanted to be remembered, by passing on this concept that they had of God, of how He operates, of how to receive His blessings, and how to worship Him. The problem is this: when you start humanizing the divine image, and you start making or trying to make a name for yourself in the world by humanizing God, then you're in a difficult situation. And the main problem I think that you have in this, the whole earth was involved in this. It wasn't just one family. It wasn't just half the population of the world. It was the whole earth involved in this venture. Let me ask you this question. If God allows this to happen, what's going to happen in the next generation? And what's going to be the concept of God in the next generation after that, and the next generation after that? And so what we read about is people who are no longer trying to be like God, but trying to bring God down to the level of humanity. And it was this movement and this system that brought upon them the divine disapproval of God. I want you to notice with me verse 6 here, and then I'll wrap it up. The Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them." Their offense is found in what the project stood for. And what God says is, He says, this is only the beginning of what humanity will do. If I let this happen, it's going to go all downhill from here. This is only the beginning of how far they're going to go, degrading the nature of God, portraying Him as having needs to be provided by humans. And if you read about mythology, human mythology, that's what you have. The more gods become like men, the easier it is for men to worship them. And so you have all these gods in human mythology that were just like us, right? You had gods who they were worshiping who lied, who cheated, who murdered for power and prestige and love. And think about how far man's image of God would go if God allowed for this to happen. Well, we're reaping some of the benefits. It just hasn't happened as quickly as it would have. Let me submit unto you this idea. In building this structure, the people weren't trying to climb to heaven to dethrone God, but rather they were trying to get the God that they supposedly worshiped to come down from heaven to meet them. And the people had several things in their favor. They were a united nation. They were speaking one language. They were using one vocabulary. They were motivated by one spirit of pride. They all had a compelling desire to make a name for themselves. The only thing missing in this project was the approval of God. And that's the great lesson for us today. The question for us today is not necessarily, are we united in what we do? Now listen, unity is important. That's another sermon in and of itself. But unity is not the only measure of a project as being successful. There's something that every work, that every project requires in order to have God's blessing, and that is it has to be approved by Him. And it doesn't matter how united we are in something, if it's not united on God's standard and God's principle, then that thing becomes displeasing to God.
And what we learn, the great lesson and application from this story is if unity without God's approval is worthy of punishment in the eyes of God. And that's, Lord willing, what we'll talk about when we come back from having our bellies full so we can all fall asleep.